Madeleine was reported missing, one of the McCann's friends, Jane Tanner, made a statement to the Portuguese police saying that she saw a man carrying a child away from the apartment. Now, just over 2 weeks later, there was another person came forward, or another family came forward, the Smith family, and they said that they saw a person carrying a child away from the apartment about 600 yards away, but about 45 minutes later. So that's 2 sightings of somebody carrying a child away from the apartment.
Amid the chaos, one action still unsettles the narrative. Gerry, a grieving father, was reported to have taken a broken refrigerator from the family's rented villa to a local dump. Why would this matter at such a time? In a blog post, now deleted, he is said to have described this unusual errand, even mentioning the support of locals at the dump. Online forums such as British Proof Reporting soon erupted with speculation. Some asked whether the fridge might have contained evidence. According to a Portuguese newspaper, the villa's owners were never informed. From this, the so-called refrigerator theory emerged, a dark suggestion that Madeleine's body had been concealed in such a way. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please tell me where you saw this video from. I will read it all and spread it to the world. No concrete proof of this exists. The blog itself has disappeared. Why would a father, with his daughter missing, concern himself with a fridge? And most importantly, there remains absolutely no evidence that Madeleine is dead. That raised the central question: who has actually been looking for Madeleine? Who has been searching over the last 2 years? Gerry answered, "It is us and our investigation team." One commentator observed, "The Madeleine McCann case is a labyrinth of questions, but few are as haunting as the 24-day gap between her disappearance on 3 May 2007 and the moment her parents, Gerry and Kate McCann, rented a silver Renault Scenic on 27 May. This unremarkable family car soon became a lightning rod for suspicion when 2 British specialist dogs, Eddie and Keela, were deployed in Praia da Luz. Their findings shifted the case dramatically. Traces of decomposition were detected, along with DNA that showed an 88% similarity to Madeleine's profile in the boot of the car. How could such traces appear in a vehicle rented weeks after the disappearance, especially under Portugal's sweltering 40°C heat, where decomposition is rapid? Portuguese investigators pointed to one unsettling possibility: refrigeration. Let's step back. Madeleine had vanished from apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort, while her parents dined nearby. For 24 days, searches swept beaches, scrubland, and alleyways. Yet nothing emerged, until the Renault Scenic entered the picture. The McCanns rented it from Budget in Lagos, a practical choice for a family far from home. But when Eddie, a dog trained to detect the scent of human remains, alerted to the boot, and Keela, trained to detect traces of blood, identified biological evidence, the narrative took a sharp turn. The dog's alerts were not random. They were precise, consistent, and troubling. Forensic tests confirmed DNA markers in the boot, matching Madeleine's profile with an 88% probability. Not conclusive, but high enough to raise serious questions. Still, experts clarified that such a percentage was not definitive. A DNA profile can resemble that of siblings, and so it could not be treated as final proof. Why did this matter? Because decomposition is relentless. In the scorching Algarve climate, an exposed body would deteriorate rapidly, leaving skeletal remains within weeks. Yet the scent in the Renault Scenic suggested something else, that a body may have been preserved deliberately to slow the process. Portuguese-led investigator Gonçalo Amaral, a seasoned detective, seized on this. He theorized that if Madeleine had died, her body must have been stored in a cold environment, a fridge or freezer, before being moved. Without such preservation, the extreme heat would have made discreet transport nearly impossible. The faint but detectable scent, Amaral argued, implied that remains had been kept in cold storage and only later moved, with the Renault Scenic fitting this timeline. Chemical compounds produced by decomposition do not simply vanish. They seep into fabrics and materials, persisting despite cleaning. In the Renault's boot, the traces were strong enough for Eddie to detect weeks later. The degraded DNA added another piece to the puzzle. Critics noted that the sample could belong to Madeleine's siblings, Amélie or Sean, since close relatives share genetic markers. Yet the 88% match leaned toward Madeleine. Portuguese police did not accept the McCann's alternative explanations. Relatives had suggested spoiled shrimp, dirty nappies, or leaked supermarket meat as sources of the smell. Alexander Cameron, Gerry's brother-in-law, even claimed that blood from packaged meat may have tainted the boot. Kate's cousin, Michael Wright, pointed to nappies. But such explanations faltered. Specially trained dogs do not confuse fish or nappies with human remains, nor would a blood detection dog mistake beef drippings. Amaral's team pressed further. The Renault was not rented until 27th of May, meaning that if remains were involved, they had been concealed for over 3 weeks. Where could that have been? Praia da Luz was swarming with police, journalists, and volunteers in those early days. Concealing remains in plain sight would have been nearly impossible without refrigeration. Amaral's theory was shaped by his experience in a 2005 case involving another young girl in the Algarve, where refrigeration was suspected though no body was ever recovered. The parallels were striking. Another missing child, another Algarve town, another investigation gone cold. The Renault Scenic was not just a car. It became a timeline. If Madeleine had died on or around May, her remains would have needed to be stored somewhere accessible, but hidden. Apartment 5A was searched thoroughly. But what about nearby rentals or villas? Amaral's team began searching properties with fridges or freezers, a lead cut short when he was abruptly removed from the case in October 2007. The timing of his dismissal raised suspicion. Was it mere coincidence that his focus on refrigeration coincided with his removal? The scent in the Renault, the DNA, and the 24-day gap together painted a disturbing picture. Amaral believed that remains had been preserved, moved, and then disposed of. The McCanns, through their spokesman Clarence Mitchell, dismissed this theory as absurd. They maintained that Madeleine had been abducted, a position supported by much of the British press, though met with skepticism in Portugal. The evidence from the Renault Scenic was not conclusive enough for charges. Portuguese law demands certainty, and while the dog's alerts and the DNA were troubling, they were insufficient to meet that standard. Still, Amaral remained convinced. For him, the 24-day gap was central, the unanswered window that might hold the truth or bury it permanently. In the searing heat of Praia da Luz, where Madeleine McCann's disappearance in May 2007 became a global obsession, Amaral stood at the center of the investigation. A detective with decades of experience, he focused not on the public emotion, but on a stark hypothesis, that Madeleine's body had been preserved in a refrigerator, possibly in another apartment, before being moved. Just as his team began pursuing this theory, Amaral was taken off the case, leaving a trail of unanswered questions and lasting controversy. His story, told later in interviews, in his book The Truth of the Lie, and in the Maddie podcast, reveals a man caught in political pressure, media battles, and a relentless search for answers that never fully surfaced. With more than 20 years in the Polícia Judiciária, Amaral was no stranger to grim cases. Only 2 years before, in 2005, he had investigated the tragic death of 8-year-old Joana Cipriano, in nearby Portimao, just 7 miles from Praia da Luz. That earlier case, often described as a grim precursor, involved the disappearance of Joanna Cipriano. Her killers later confessed to storing her remains in a freezer to delay decomposition, a tactic that left no physical evidence to recover and led to Portugal's first major trial without a body being found. The parallels with Madeleine McCann's case were striking. A young girl vanished, physical evidence was scarce, and once again refrigeration was suggested to explain the absence of natural decay. For investigator Gonçalo Amaral, this was not idle speculation, but a pattern he recognized. In a 2010 interview with bloggers, he stated, "The fluids found in the car show that if the body had been buried, it would have undergone mummification." The fact that there were fluids instead points to refrigeration. His prior experiences shaped his perspective, and he was unafraid to pursue that line even when it clashed with the McCann's insistence on abduction. His investigation took a decisive turn when the specialist sniffer dogs Eddie and Keela, brought in from the UK, alerted to traces of decomposition and possible blood in apartment 5A, and in the Renault Scenic the McCanns had rented. Their alerts suggested contact with human remains that had not decomposed in the usual way. In Portugal's blistering May heat, averaging close to 40 degrees Celsius, natural decomposition would have advanced rapidly, leaving clear signs within weeks. Yet the faint scent picked up in the Renault suggested something different, that preservation had taken place. Amaral's team began to hypothesize that the remains were kept cold, possibly in a fridge or freezer, before being moved. This was not a wild conjecture, but an argument grounded in forensic reasoning. Compounds from decomposition can cling to surfaces for long periods, but their presence in a vehicle rented weeks after Madeleine's disappearance suggested storage in a controlled environment. Amaral's focus shifted to the idea of a hidden apartment in Praia da Luz, somewhere with a refrigerator large enough to conceal a small child. As he revealed in episode 10 of the Maddie podcast, "It is not impossible. It was a possibility we were investigating." Yet the question was not only about fridges, it was also about time and opportunity. The McCann's movements in the hours following Madeleine's disappearance were studied closely. Amaral noted what he considered a critical 6-hour window on 30 May 2007 between around 7 o'clock and 8:30 p.m., when Kate McCann's whereabouts were not firmly accounted for. According to Portuguese newspaper Diário de Notícias, while Gerry played tennis, neither Kate nor Madeleine was definitively seen, creating a gap that fueled suspicion. The McCann's friends, later dubbed the Tapas 7, broke their silence in September 2007 to insist that Kate was with them, but restaurant staff contradicted this, claiming Madeleine had not been seen after 6 o'clock p.m. This inconsistency, highlighted by the Daily Star, became central to Amaral's concerns. Could Madeleine have been moved or hidden during that window? Was she perhaps placed in a nearby apartment, its fridge, quietly storing her as the world searched outside? Amaral's pursuit of this lead was met with resistance. British newspapers such as the Daily Mail and Daily Telegraph often portrayed him as a rogue officer pursuing far-fetched theories, while Portuguese outlets, like Diário de Notícias, gave more attention to his refrigeration hypothesis. This clash of narratives became more than a media debate. It was a struggle for control of the story itself. The McCanns, through their spokesman Clarence Mitchell, dismissed the freezer theory outright, calling it absurd and pointing out the impracticality of fitting a body into a small holiday apartment fridge. Amaral, however, argued that his theory was not about the compact fridges in the Ocean Club apartments, but about the possibility of larger appliances in other villas or rentals nearby. His team had even begun mapping every potential cold storage location in Praia da Luz when, suddenly, the investigation was taken from him. In October 2007, just as his team was pursuing this line, Amaral was removed from the case. Officially, the reason cited was a newspaper interview in which he was critical of British police involvement. Yet, Amaral later claimed in the Maddie podcast that his removal was the result of political pressure, an orchestrated attempt to shut down his direction of inquiry. He alleged that his superiors installed a new team intent on shelving the case, a claim he repeated in his 2008 book, The Truth of the Lie. The timing was notable. His dismissal came only a month after the McCanns were named arguidos, official suspects, and just as his team began searching for the elusive apartment. In a 2010 interview with Correio da Manhã, Amaral speculated that the remains, after being kept at one location, were later moved by car some 20 days after the disappearance, and he cited fluid traces as evidence pointing to refrigeration. He argued that the preservation of fluids was consistent with freezing or cold storage. His removal meant that this line of investigation was never completed, leaving the refrigerator theory unresolved. Amaral continued to argue that the British authorities suppressed certain leads, including testimony that hinted at links to an international network potentially connected to the McCanns' wider circle. In The Truth of the Lie, he accused his successors of deliberately winding the case down, which was formally archived in August 2008 without any charges. The book itself provoked a fierce legal battle. The McCanns sued Amaral for libel, claiming his allegations deeply damaged their family and undermined the ongoing search for Madeleine. Kate McCann, in a 2014 interview with The Mirror, described sleepless nights haunted by the accusations that she and Gerry had hidden their daughter. She even recalled her 9-year-old son asking, "Mr. Amaral said you hid Madeleine, didn't he?" The lawsuit dragged on for years, but in 2017, the McCanns lost, leaving Amaral's narrative legally intact. Critics portrayed him as obsessive, a man too influenced by past cases such as the Joanna Cipriano investigation, arguing that this biased his judgment in Madeleine's case. His supporters, however, saw him as a determined detective willing to challenge a polished public image, a man whose instincts were informed by forensic evidence and professional experience. The dog's alerts, the DNA markers, and the unexplained 24-day gap were not inventions. They were data points. In 2019, British investigator Colin Sutton visited Praia da Luz and explored whether remains could have been hidden without refrigeration, suggesting alternatives such as shallow graves or storm drains. Yet Amaral's theory held firm for many. The fluid traces in the Renault Scenic pointed more to preservation than exposure to the elements. Amaral's removal left his work fractured, a trail of what-ifs. What if he had been allowed to continue searching those apartments? What if the refrigeration lead had been followed to its conclusion? The Daily Star reported in September 2007 that Portuguese police had begun checking every cooler in Praia da Luz, but without Amaral at the helm, the momentum faded. His book and later podcast interviews remain a voice in the wilderness, a warning that political pressure and media control may have buried the truth. Whether or not his refrigeration theory was correct, one fact is clear. Amaral believed he saw something that others either ignored or chose not to confront. And in those unanswered questions, the mystery of Madeleine McCann's fate remains. In the fevered summer of 2007, as the world focused on the disappearance of a 3-year-old girl, one detail continues to stand out. Gerry McCann, Madeleine's father, reportedly wrote on his blog about an unusual task, personally hauling a broken refrigerator from their rented villa to a local dump. This was not a call to the landlord or a casual mention of maintenance. It was Gerry himself, in the middle of a global search for his missing child, disposing of a household appliance. Later, As scrutiny of the family intensified, that blog post vanished, erased from the record. Was it simply an innocent anecdote from a father under immense pressure? Or was it, as critics suggested, a detail pointing towards something more troubling? The refrigerator theory, already circulating within the Portuguese investigation, gained new energy from this missing post. True crime forums soon seized on the story, with amateur sleuths dissecting its implications. A blogger under the name Bailey Boy on the British proof reporting site claimed in November 2007 that Gerry had shared the account earlier that summer, describing the villa's malfunctioning freezer, not the Ocean Club apartment, but the rented villa, and his decision to drive it to a rubbish tip. According to the account, he even remarked on how supportive the people at the dump had been, a curious aside for a man whose daughter had been missing for weeks. At that time, the McCanns were bolstered by global sympathy, their fundraising campaign growing rapidly, their faces appearing constantly in the media. Gerry, known for his precise and controlled manner, appeared confident enough to share even such a trivial act publicly. When Gerry and Kate were named arguidos, formal suspects, in September 2007, the blog post in question was said to have disappeared. Bloggers claimed to hold screenshots, but offered no verifiable proof. And to critics of the abduction narrative, the timing felt almost too neat, a digital vanishing act that seemed to confirm their doubts. At the same time, Amaral's team was scouring Praia da Luz for apartments with substantial cooling units, pursuing a lead that suggested Madeleine's remains might have been kept in cold storage before being moved. And against this backdrop, Gerry's alleged blog entry about disposing of a refrigerator ceased to look merely odd and began to function as an alarm bell. Why would a grieving father, in the midst of an all-consuming search, prioritize such a chore? And why take it upon himself rather than contact the villa's owner who, according to a Portuguese newspaper, was never informed? The online community seized on the incongruity. Forum posts asked how a tenant ends up hauling away a broken fridge rather than arranging a repair or replacement, with one commenter even wondering whether the owner might have had a relative who could fix it. And for those unconvinced by the abduction account, the story appeared to fit a darker reading. That if the child had died, her body might have been placed in the villa's refrigerator, with the lining possibly absorbing fluids associated with decomposition. A graphic idea often softened in discussion, but regarded by some as plausible, in light of the forensic threads then circulating. In this view, the disposal of the appliance was framed as an urgent attempt to remove a damaging object, and the post's disappearance was read as a hurried effort to erase a trail once suspicion grew. Portuguese investigators, already exploring the refrigeration hypothesis, were said to consider the reported blog entry potentially important, and Amaral, whose perspective had been shaped by the 2005 Joana Cipriano case, where freezing was alleged, believed that preservation could help explain the indications later associated with the Renault Scenic. Specialist dogs, Eddie and Keela, had alerted at the car's boot and the apartment, with subsequent testing discussed publicly as yielding DNA markers, reportedly showing an 88% similarity to Madeleine's profile. And if the blog account were accurate, it would align with a timeline in which remains were kept cold for weeks and moved only after the McCanns rented the Renault. Some bloggers even claimed the fridge was recovered from the dump, prompting questions. Was it ever examined for DNA or biological material, though no records confirm such testing? While reports that Portuguese police checked coolers across Praia da Luz suggested the lead was, at minimum, taken seriously. The McCanns' camp pushed back firmly, maintaining that Madeleine was abducted, a position amplified by British outlets citing the Tapas 7 to counter police suspicion. But these defenses did not directly address the blog post itself. leaving a question. If it was entirely benign, why delete it? Especially when Gerry's blog was otherwise a carefully managed window into their ordeal. The absence of any cached or archived version, often pointed out in online debates, kept the claim unverified. Yet its persistence spoke to the public imagination. Critics of the refrigeration thread called it speculative noise, noting that Amaral did not specify a particular fridge in his book The Truth of the Lie, and reminding audiences that the Renault DNA could also be consistent with close relatives, and that a scent associated with decomposition might transfer via contaminated items rather than direct contact. But supporters countered that these points struggled against the broader timeline. Relatives Alexander Cameron and Michael Wright offered explanations, leaking meat, discarded nappies, that did not persuade those familiar with cadaver dogs trained to ignore ordinary food odors and household waste. The alleged deletion of the post, coinciding with Arguido status, was presented by skeptics as part of an image management pattern, consistent with Gerry's reputation for careful control. Why share such a detail unless it felt safe, until suddenly it did not? Ultimately, the vanishing blog entry became a microcosm of the Madeleine McCann case, an alluring clue submerged in ambiguity, prompting the unresolved question of whether it was an ill-judged aside, erased when scrutiny intensified, or a myth born in the echo chambers of the internet. To investigators pursuing Amaral's refrigeration theory, it looked like one piece of a larger picture, remains preserved, transferred, and hidden. But without the post's text or proof of what happened to the appliance, it remains a shadow. In Praia da Luz, where the case endures without final answers, the tale of a dumped fridge and a deleted note refuses to fade, suggesting a possibility that feels, to some, too cold to contemplate. In the wider inquiry, attention also fell on two statements by relatives: Alexander Cameron, Gerry's brother-in-law, and Michael Wright, Kate's cousin, because of what they implied rather than what they proved. Cameron told police on the 15th of April 2008 that during a supermarket run in July 2007, over 2 months after the disappearance, he and Patricia, Gerry's sister, bought items including shrimp, fish, and beef, transported in the Renault Scenic, rented roughly 24 days after Madeleine was reported missing. And as they unloaded the shopping, he said he saw blood coming from the bottom of a bag, a detail that seemed unremarkable at the time, but would later be viewed in a different light. In the days after, he noticed an unpleasant smell in the vehicle, which he attributed to food leakage or accumulated rubbish, and he responded by removing the boot carpet and fabric lining, wiping the boot with a damp cloth, and leaving the carpet to air, an unusually thorough reaction for what was described as seafood leakage, and one that, to some, carried implications. Intentionally or not, he had acknowledged the presence of blood in the boot, and a smell strong enough to warrant partial disassembly and deep cleaning of the exact area where cadaver dogs would later alert. On the 16th April 2008, Wright gave his own statement, saying that as a frequent driver of the Renault Scenic, he too noticed unpleasant odors, but he attributed them to nappies briefly kept in the car before disposal, suggesting the smell was consistent with routine waste rather than anything more serious. Investigators noted the discrepancy, raw meat leakage versus nappies, and neither man supplied corroboration, such as receipts for large seafood purchases or records showing nappy bags in the vehicle, and no one else recalled transporting those items at the relevant times. What both statements shared, however, was an acknowledgement of strong, persistent odors and unusually robust efforts to address them, which for some observers raised further questions. Why remove and clean a boot carpet for fish blood? And if the issue were simply nappies, Why did no other witness report the same smell? In forensic terms, the scent associated with human decomposition, often discussed via compounds like cadaverine, is significant because it can be detected by trained dogs even at very low levels, and unlike everyday odors, can penetrate fabrics and bind to surfaces in ways that make it exceptionally hard to eradicate. Factors that kept these details alive in debate, even as definitive proof remained elusive. What is more, compounds linked to decomposition can transfer from one object to another, meaning that if someone handled a body and later touched clothing or upholstery, the scent could remain and still be detectable by trained dogs, days or even weeks afterwards. This science explains why the dog's alerts in the Renault Scenic were taken so seriously. They did not alert randomly. They pinpointed the boot area, the very same spot where Alexander Cameron had reported seeing leaked blood, and the correlation was disturbingly precise. Furthermore, the odor associated with cadaverine is fundamentally distinct from everyday household smells. It is not something dogs confuse with rubbish, food, or even nappy waste. These animals were not ordinary pets. They had been deployed in high-profile investigations across Europe and were specifically trained to distinguish between animal blood and traces linked to human remains. In Madeleine McCann's case, their alerts were regarded as some of the most striking pieces of physical evidence, suggesting that a body may have been present in the car. Yet despite this, the explanations offered by Cameron and Wright were met with caution by investigators. From a policing perspective, the fact that two close relatives gave two entirely different reasons for the same suspicious smell raised concerns. The disparity suggested coordination without consistency, often seen as a sign of improvisation. Even more telling was the cleanup itself. Removing a boot carpet and wiping the interior with a damp cloth is not a typical reaction to a bit of fish blood. It is the sort of behavior one might expect if trying to remove more permanent biological traces, DNA, fluids, or scent, that could connect a space to human remains. In the end, those two statements, intended to clarify, did little to reduce suspicion around the Renault Scenic. Instead, they opened the door to deeper questions. Was a body ever present in that car? If so, where had it been kept before? Could the blood Alexander claimed to see really have come from seafood, or did it belong to Madeleine? As with so many aspects of this case, the answers remain elusive. What lingers, just like the scent that once filled the Renault's boot, is the unsettling possibility that what was brushed aside too quickly may in fact have been a glimpse into something much darker. One of the most puzzling and under-examined aspects of Madeleine McCann's disappearance is what has come to be called the 6-hour gap. This refers to a stretch of time on 3rd May 2007, the day she vanished, during which the whereabouts of both Madeleine and her mother Kate could not be independently verified. Although later overshadowed by more dramatic developments, this time window has been regarded by Portuguese investigators and journalists as a potentially crucial segment of the timeline, one that remains deeply suspicious. According to British media coverage in September 2007, Portuguese police believed there was a period of roughly 6 hours, from about 2:00 p.m. to 8:30 p.m., during which no one outside the McCann's circle could clearly confirm the movements of Kate and Madeleine. Within that time frame, it was the period from 7:00 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. that investigators studied most closely. Some suspected that during this window, a tragic event may have occurred, or that actions were taken to conceal the consequences of one. A report dated 29th of September 2007 noted that investigators were reviewing CCTV footage to trace Kate and Gerry McCann's movements during those exact hours. It suggested that police suspected Madeleine may have died during this period, and that her body could have been moved or hidden before authorities were called. Though this information was never officially confirmed, its appearance in the media pointed to an internal belief within law enforcement that something significant may have taken place in those missing hours. Matters were complicated further by conflicting testimony from staff at the Ocean Club's tapas restaurant and the group of friends known as the Tapas Seven, who were dining with the McCanns the night Madeleine disappeared. For more than 4 months after her disappearance, the group remained silent. But in September 2007, just as questions about the time gap intensified, they broke their silence. They gave statements defending Kate McCann's whereabouts that evening, asserting she had been with them or with Madeleine throughout. Yet their claims were not universally corroborated. Several restaurant staff members gave accounts that placed Kate at times inconsistent with the Tapas Seven's version. Some later argued that staff could have confused dates due to the number of guests at the resort, but the inconsistencies were striking enough to concern investigators. At the very least, they highlighted the absence of independent confirmation of Kate's movements during that critical period. Adding to suspicion was the fact that Gerry was known to be playing tennis during part of the early evening, which left Kate potentially alone with the children. Police suggested this created a window in which something could have happened or been concealed. Though this theory was never proven, it shaped investigative thinking at the time. Breaking the discrepancies down further, the Tapas Seven claimed Kate was always with them, or with the children that afternoon and evening, but they offered no independent evidence to support this. Their accounts relied on their own word. Restaurant staff offered observations that clashed with this timeline, and although some were later discounted, the contradictions could not be fully reconciled. Police also reportedly reviewed CCTV footage, which suggested movements that did not perfectly align with the McCanns' statements, though these findings were never made public. This combination of inconsistent testimony, missing data, and unverified sightings created fertile ground for doubt. The concern for police was clear. The 6-hour period could have provided time to cover up an accidental death, to temporarily store or conceal remains, or to move them away from the apartment. What is undisputed is that it was only after 10:00 p.m. that Kate McCann raised the alarm that Madeleine was missing, by which time many at the resort were already aware. If something had occurred earlier, and if an abduction narrative was staged, then it would have needed to be set in motion before that announcement. This suspicion was strengthened by Amaral's refrigeration theory, which aligned neatly with the timing. He believed those unaccounted for hours could have been used to place a body in cold storage or move it elsewhere. No conclusive evidence emerged to prove this, but the timing aligned too conveniently for some to dismiss. If something did happen between 2:00 p.m. and 8:30 p.m., and if Kate was alone with the children at times, then it raised the possibility that Madeleine's disappearance was not an abduction, but an incident followed by concealment. In this context, the Tapas Seven's collective reappearance in the media 4 months later seemed less spontaneous and more strategic. Some saw it as a natural defense against suspicion, while others viewed it as a coordinated effort at damage control. At the heart of this debate lies a crucial question. Who outside of Kate can independently confirm that Madeleine was alive and well during the final hours of 3rd May? The lack of an independent answer has haunted the case for over a decade. In criminal investigations, inconsistencies in alibis and unexplained gaps in time often become the cracks through which truth begins to emerge. In Madeleine's disappearance, the 6-hour gap remains one of the most glaring mysteries. Whether it represents a window of opportunity, an innocent coincidence, or something more complex, is still unknown. What it certainly represents is a moment where certainty dissolves and speculation begins, a shadow over an already heartbreaking case. And beyond the police files, another battleground was emerging: the media itself. From the beaches of Praia da Luz to the offices of Britain's biggest tabloids, A quiet but fierce battle of narratives unfolded. At the center was one unsettling theory: that Madeleine McCann's body may have been placed in a refrigerator or freezer before being moved. Portuguese media outlets were willing to explore the idea, while most British papers recoiled from it. The result was a fragmented and emotionally charged media landscape where facts, suspicions, and loyalties collided with devastating intensity. Among the first to touch on the possibility of refrigerated concealment was Diário de Notícias, a respected Portuguese newspaper with a reputation for sober reporting far removed from the sensationalism of tabloids. In a piece published not long after Madeleine's disappearance, the paper stated that Portuguese police believed she may have died between 7 o'clock and 8:30 p.m. on the evening of 3rd of May 2007, while Gerry McCann was playing tennis. Crucially, it reported that officers were conducting discreet operations to identify apartments with fridges in Praia da Luz. These quiet searches, largely unnoticed at the time, suggested that investigators were seriously considering whether Madeleine's body could have been kept cold before being relocated. This marked the first credible public mention of what would become known, controversially, as the refrigerator theory. The newspaper's decision to explore the possibility set it apart from others, particularly those outside Portugal. It revealed that this line of inquiry was not mere speculation, but was linked to genuine police activity. While it did not directly accuse the McCanns, it opened the door to a darker and more complex narrative than the straightforward abduction story first presented to the public. The Irish Independent adopted a more neutral stance, but still acknowledged the controversy. It covered the growing scrutiny, noting the wave of claims and counterclaims emerging from Portugal. One article focused on the McCann family's frustration with what they described as a smear campaign, highlighting in particular a rumor that Kate McCann had accidentally caused her daughter's death and hidden the body in a fridge. The Irish Independent did not endorse the theory, but by mentioning it, the paper acknowledged its growing traction in public discourse. The focus was less on the theory's plausibility and more on the emotional toll it was taking on the family. Even so, by reporting it, the paper left readers to weigh the claim for themselves. Among British papers, the Daily Star was a rare exception. On the 29th of September 2007, it published a headline that shocked many. Maddie's body was stored in a freezer. Citing unnamed police sources, the article claimed investigators thought Madeleine may have been stored in a freezer before being disposed of, and that officers were attempting to locate every cooler in Praia da Luz. For a British outlet, this was a bombshell. The report appeared to confirm the existence of targeted searches for refrigeration units in the area and aligned closely with the Portuguese investigation. Yet the article was printed alongside statements from the Tapas 7, the McCann's friends who had finally broken their silence after months, insisting that neither Kate nor Gerry could have been involved. This juxtaposition highlighted a deep split, not only in public perception, but within the British media itself. While the Daily Star ventured into forensic suspicion, it also echoed the McCann's defense, cushioning the impact of its headline. Other papers, such as the Daily Telegraph, took a much more protective stance. In a report headlined, "Maddie's parents beg for slurs to end," the paper quoted directly from Diário de Notícias, but did so with skepticism, portraying Kate and Gerry as victims of malicious rumor and unfounded accusation. Central to the Telegraph's coverage was Clarence Mitchell, the McCann's spokesman, who issued a strong rebuttal. "It's utterly ridiculous. Allegation after allegation, unsourced, unsubstantiated, and unnamed." By doing so, he dismissed not only the refrigerator theory, but also the entire Portuguese line of inquiry, characterizing it as tabloid fantasy, despite some of it originating in serious newspapers and linked to police operations. Clarence Mitchell played an outsized role in shaping how the British public understood the case. More than a spokesperson, he became the McCann's media strategist, deciding which narratives were acceptable and which were to be rejected outright. He frequently appeared in interviews to challenge claims and shield the family from hostile coverage. Asked directly about the suggestion of a body being stored in a fridge, Mitchell scoffed, "Utterly ridiculous, total rubbish. Have you seen the size of fridges in those apartments?" He emphasized that the standard units in the Ocean Club were far too small, framing the theory as not only offensive but also logistically impossible. His certainty and clarity in rebuttal helped secure a more sympathetic narrative for the McCanns in the British press. On the opposite side of this divide was Gonçalo Amaral, the Portuguese lead investigator, who first voiced suspicions that Madeleine might have died before the supposed abduction, and that her body had been preserved before being moved. After being removed from the case, Amaral published his book, The Truth of the Lie, elaborating on theories that he claimed British authorities and media had attempted to suppress. He later argued, "The British press protected the McCanns and silenced lines of inquiry we were pursuing." This statement underscored a defining feature of the case. Not merely a clash of investigative approaches, but a battle of media ecosystems shaped by different agendas. British outlets overwhelmingly presented Amaral as a disgraced detective, biased and embittered, and the word disgraced became almost synonymous with his name in UK headlines. Yet observers noticed the irony. Even as Amaral's ideas were publicly dismissed, the Daily Star had already acknowledged the existence of the refrigeration hypothesis. The very theory Amaral advanced, while derided in one breath, was echoed in fragments in the British press, albeit softened with sympathetic quotes and rebuttals. In the end, the divergence between Portuguese and British coverage revealed something deeper than journalistic bias. It showed how two nations, influenced by different legal systems, cultural norms, and political pressures, could look at the same set of facts and reach starkly different conclusions. Portuguese outlets pursued forensic possibilities, however cautiously, while British outlets largely sought to shield a grieving family. Where Amaral saw obstruction, British media saw defamation. Between these two clashing narratives, the truth, if it could ever be clearly known, was frozen beneath layers of suspicion, loyalty, and silence. In the aftermath of Madeleine McCann's disappearance, the world watched as Gerry and Kate stepped into the harsh spotlight of international media. From the very beginning, their public appearances showed remarkable composure, consistent messaging, and a level of strategic communication more reminiscent of a political campaign than of parents in grief. Beneath the surface of sympathy and sorrow, analysts began to notice something striking. The McCanns were not merely reacting to the storm, they were actively managing it. From the earliest days of the investigation, they projected a unified and deliberate image. Press conferences were delivered side by side. Statements were brief and solemn, and composure was never allowed to falter in front of cameras. They became the face of a carefully orchestrated media strategy, polished, consistent, and deliberate. Behind this stood Clarence Mitchell, a former BBC journalist and government press officer who was hired as the family's full-time spokesperson. His task was clear: protect the McCann's narrative, refute speculation, and steer the conversation away from anything that might cast doubt on their innocence. That, in effect, became Clarence Mitchell's brief, and he quickly turned into a constant presence across television studios and in newspaper quotes. Whenever a new line emerged, whether the much-debated refrigerator theory or the alerts from specialist dogs in the rental car, he responded with rapid-fire rebuttals, reverting to the refrain of baseless, unsubstantiated, and utterly ridiculous, so that each time Portuguese reports floated a fresh angle or an investigative leak hinted at forensic inconsistencies, an immediate and authoritative denial followed. In this framing, the McCanns were not merely being defended, they were being managed like public figures, and for many observers that raised uncomfortable questions. Was this the response of a family navigating trauma, or a strategic media operation controlling the narrative at every step. One of the most unusual features of Gerry McCann's public stance in the weeks after Madeleine's disappearance was his daily blog. Amid the height of crisis, he maintained a steady stream of calm, measured entries, written with reassurance and resolve, documenting meetings, prayer vigils, and fundraising efforts, rarely, if ever, conveying confusion, despair, or emotional collapse, the very expressions some might expect from a father enduring the unendurable. Psychologists and media analysts noted the peculiarity. What father, mere weeks after such a loss, finds the composure and clarity to blog daily? And while it might have been therapeutic, a deeper pattern seemed to emerge. The blog functioned not only as a personal outlet, but as a tool of image construction, consistent, positive, and in control, with little mention of raw fear or doubt, presenting the McCanns as composed, rational, and proactive, the very image most likely to inspire sympathy and public trust. In psychological terms, this resembled narrative control, shaping public perception through curated communication so that a tidy, measured story centered on victimhood could hold suspicion at arm's length. Perhaps the most intriguing clue in this pattern of behavioral control was the quiet deletion of one specific entry in which Gerry reportedly wrote that the refrigerator in their rented villa had broken and that he had personally taken it to a dump, a small, mundane detail that later acquired ominous significance when Portuguese detectives considered whether Madeleine's remains might have been kept in a freezer prior to being moved. When Gerry was named arguido, a formal suspect, this post disappeared without explanation or acknowledgement, and in the vacuum that followed, speculation surged. Bloggers claimed to have saved copies. Investigators questioned the timing, yet no one could confirm the original text, and the McCanns did not comment. In psychological terms, this looked like emotional trace management, the deliberate removal of potentially incriminating or emotionally inconsistent records to preserve a specific narrative, so that what once seemed harmless now appeared a problematic puzzle piece. And by erasing it, Gerry may not have been concealing guilt, but he was surely curating memory. This was more than digital housekeeping. It was mission-driven storytelling. Beyond words, their physical presence also communicated control. Appearances were carefully managed. Kate and Gerry dressed modestly and formally, faces solemn but not distressed. Emotion rarely permitted to override structure, and in interviews, Kate often avoided specific questions, especially about the last sighting of Madeleine or timeline inconsistencies, deferring to Mitchell or shifting to broader appeals about love, hope, and community support rather than hard detail, a classic public relations technique. Remain in the safe zone, speak only to prepared, rehearsed, and sanitized points. Avoid reactive answers and ambiguity. Maintain sympathy and credibility. And before we close, how does this make you feel about the timeline gaps, the media strategies, the vanished post, and the forensic threads? Do these developments lead you to any tentative conclusion, or do they deepen your doubts? If you were in the audience with one action to take, share a perspective, highlight an overlooked detail, ask one question the public has missed, what would you do next?